For nearly 500 years, an image of the Virgin Mary has remained at the center of one of the most extraordinary stories in the Catholic world, an image traditionally associated with a humble indigenous man named Juan Diego, a bishop who demanded a sign, a miraculous appearance of flowers in the middle of winter, and a tilma that, according to Catholic tradition, revealed an image that no one expected to see. But what makes the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe so fascinating today is not simply the devotion of millions of Catholics, and it is not merely the fact that the image has inspired generations of prayer. It is that the image is still here, and investigators have spent decades asking a question that remains surprisingly difficult to answer completely. How was this image originally created? Tonight, on Catholic Nighttime Mysteries, we are going to look at 5 of the most fascinating and best-supported mysteries surrounding the Tilma of Guadalupe. Let's begin with the 5th mystery. How exactly was the original image created? When we look at an old painting, we often assume that the artist simply placed paint onto a surface and produced the finished image. But professional artists traditionally worked through a process of preparation, proportion, sketching, underdrawing, and layering, leaving behind physical clues that modern investigators can often detect centuries later. That is why the examination of Guadalupe using infrared photography became so important. In 1981, photographer and infrared specialist Philip Cerna Callahan, working with Jody Brant Smith, examined the image using infrared techniques designed to reveal details that ordinary visible light could not easily show. Their examination produced results that have continued to generate discussion. In significant portions of the image, conventional preparatory drawing was not readily apparent in the way one might expect from an ordinary painting. And this became one of the reasons investigators began asking whether the original image had been produced through a process that was different from conventional artistic methods of the period. Now, this does not mean that science has proved that no human being could have produced the image. It does not mean that every part of the present image is untouched. And it certainly does not mean that modern science has established that there are absolutely no pigments or later modifications. In fact, investigators have identified evidence of additions and alterations, which means that when we speak about the Guadalupe image, we have to distinguish between the original image and everything that may have been added or changed throughout its long history. But that distinction actually makes the central mystery more interesting. If there are later modifications, then what did the original image look like? How was it originally formed? And why has no universally accepted explanation completely settled the question? After decades of scientific examination, we still do not have a simple answer that explains every feature of the original image. For a Catholic, that uncertainty does not have to be frightening. It can be an invitation to wonder. And for a scientist, it is an invitation to continue investigating. Because the mystery is not that nobody has ever studied the tilma. The mystery is that people have studied it extensively, using technologies that could not possibly have been imagined in the 16th century, and yet some important questions remain. And that brings us to the 4th mystery. The eyes. At normal viewing distance, the eyes of Our Lady appear small and simple, exactly as we might expect in a religious image viewed from several feet away. But when photographs are enlarged and digitally analyzed, researchers have reported something remarkable within those tiny areas. They have reported seeing forms that resemble human figures. The most famous investigator associated with this theory is Mexican engineer José Estaturnsman, who studied the eyes using digital image analysis and argued that multiple figures could be detected within them. The idea is extraordinary. According to this interpretation, the eyes may contain what resembles a tiny reflected scene, with several figures apparently gathered together. And the reason this claim has attracted so much attention is that the human eye is not a flat surface. It is a curved optical structure capable of producing reflections. So if the shapes reported by these investigators really correspond to a coherent scene, rather than being random patterns or artifacts created by image enhancement, then the implication would be extraordinary. It would mean that the eyes of the image contain something resembling a miniature optical record of people standing before Mary. Some researchers have gone further and attempted to identify these figures with people associated with the traditional Guadalupe story. But here we need to make an important distinction. The existence of tiny shapes that can be interpreted as figures is one claim. The claim that science has definitively proven that these are the original witnesses of the Guadalupe apparition is another. The second claim has not been established to the same degree. Digital images can contain ambiguous patterns, and human beings are exceptionally skilled at recognizing faces and familiar forms even when the underlying shapes are uncertain. Nevertheless, the eye phenomenon remains fascinating because researchers have not simply pointed to one isolated mark and declared it a person. They have described multiple apparent forms and relationships between the two eyes, and those observations have continued to inspire investigation. And that raises an even deeper question. If the image contains details this subtle, how were those details created in the first place? That takes us to our third mystery: the strange absence of a conventional underdrawing. Imagine asking an artist in the 16th century to create a complex religious image containing carefully arranged proportions, a detailed human face, hands, clothing, folds, symbols, and a carefully balanced composition. An artist would normally have to plan. There would be measurements. There would be construction. There would often be preliminary lines that established where the major features would go before the finished colors were applied. And yet, infrared examination of substantial portions of the Guadalupe image did not reveal the kind of conventional underdrawing that investigators might expect to find beneath an ordinary painting. This does not prove that there was never any preliminary work. It does not prove that a human artist could not have created the image. But it does mean that the Tilma does not simply provide us with an obvious artistic recipe that allows modern experts to say, with certainty, exactly how the original image was constructed. And this is where the Guadalupe mystery becomes particularly compelling. Because sometimes the most convincing mysteries are not the ones where we can say, science has proved something impossible. They are the ones where we can say, science has examined the evidence carefully, and the complete explanation is still not settled. That is what makes the Guadalupe image worth investigating. We do not need to exaggerate. We do not need to claim that every scientific question has been answered in favor of a miracle. We can simply recognize that the evidence leaves genuine questions about the original production of the image. And perhaps there is something fitting about that uncertainty, because faith itself does not require us to pretend that we understand everything. The Catholic tradition has never taught that every physical characteristic of the tilma must be scientifically inexplicable. Instead, the image is understood as a sign, something that points beyond itself, and perhaps that is why the scientific questions are most meaningful when they remain connected to the deeper religious story. But before we reach that deeper meaning, we have to enter one of the most dramatic moments in the modern history of Guadalupe. The year is 1921. Mexico is living through a period of tremendous political and social instability, and the relationship between the government and the Catholic Church is deeply strained. Inside the Basilica of Guadalupe, the sacred image is being venerated. Then an explosive device is detonated near the altar. The blast is powerful enough to damage objects around it. The attack is real. The explosion is real. The damage is real. And yet the image survives. Think about that for a moment. An explosive device is detonated near one of the most revered religious images in the world. Surrounding objects are damaged, and yet the image that Catholics had venerated for generations remains. Could there be a physical explanation? Certainly. The behavior of an explosion depends upon countless factors, including the location and size of the explosive charge, the structure surrounding it, the direction of the blast, and the objects positioned between the explosion and whatever one is trying to protect. So the survival of the image cannot, by itself, be presented as a scientific proof of supernatural intervention. But neither should we casually dismiss the event. It is part of the documented history surrounding the image, and its survival became another chapter in the remarkable story of Guadalupe. For the faithful, it can be understood as an example of providential protection. For historians, it is an event that can be investigated. And for anyone looking at the long history of the Tilma, it becomes one more astonishing moment in which the image survived circumstances that could easily have destroyed it. And now we come to the first mystery. The greatest one. The simplest one. The one that requires no microscope and no digital enhancement. The image is still here. Nearly 500 years is difficult for the human mind to comprehend because our lives are measured in decades, while the Guadalupe image has crossed almost 20 generations. People who lived when the image first appeared are separated from us by an enormous distance in time. Their languages were different. Their cities were different. Their technology was different. Their political world was different. Their understanding of medicine, science, geography, and the universe was completely different from ours. And yet the image associated with their world remains present in ours. That is extraordinary. There are popular stories claiming that the textile must have been made from a particular type of agave fiber that could never survive for centuries. But the scientific history is more complicated than that, because investigators have disagreed about the exact composition of the textile and have proposed different interpretations of the materials involved. We do not need to build the entire Guadalupe mystery upon the claim that scientists have proven the fabric should have disintegrated. The stronger and more defensible observation is simply that a centuries-old textile associated with the image has survived remarkably well and remains sufficiently intact for modern investigation. That fact alone deserves our attention. The image has survived centuries of human history. It has survived periods of political upheaval and religious persecution. It has survived changes in the environment surrounding it. It has survived an explosive attack. And it remains an object that scientists can still examine today. Then there is the image itself. The face, the expression, the eyes, the arrangement of the figure, the subtle details that become visible under magnification, the unanswered questions surrounding its original production. All of these elements have contributed to the extraordinary endurance of the Guadalupe mystery. And perhaps this is why the story has never disappeared. Not because every claim made about the Tilma is true. Not because every microscopic interpretation has been proven. Not because science has somehow been defeated. But because when the exaggerations are removed, there remains a genuinely remarkable historical object, surrounded by questions that have continued to challenge researchers and fascinate believers. And now we reach the point where science and faith meet. Science can examine the fibers. It can examine the pigments. It can analyze the image under infrared light. It can magnify the eyes. It can study the circumstances of the 1921 explosion. It can compare the image with known artistic techniques and investigate how the material has been preserved. But science cannot measure what happens inside the heart of a person who kneels before the image and prays. It cannot measure consolation. It cannot measure hope. It cannot measure the experience of a person who looks upon the face of Our Lady and believes that she is not pointing attention toward herself, but toward her Son. And perhaps this is where the mystery of Guadalupe becomes more profound than any individual scientific claim. The Tilma was never meant to be simply a puzzle. For Catholics, it is a sign. It points to Mary. And through Mary, it points to Christ. Perhaps someday scientists will explain another part of the image. Perhaps future technology will clarify what is visible within the eyes. Perhaps the original artistic process will eventually be reconstructed in greater detail. Or perhaps some questions will remain unanswered for another 500 years. But if that happens, the mystery of Guadalupe will not have failed. Because an explanation for one physical feature does not erase the historical significance of the image, the devotion surrounding it, or the profound religious meaning it has carried across generations. Nearly 5 centuries ago, according to Catholic tradition, Juan Diego opened his tilma before the bishop, and the flowers that had been gathered in the cold of winter fell onto the floor. But according to that same tradition, the flowers were not the final sign. When the tilma was opened, an image of the Virgin Mary was revealed. And that image began a journey through history that no one standing in that room could possibly have imagined. The people who witnessed that moment are gone. The world they knew is gone. The political powers of their time are gone. The generations who first looked upon the image are gone. And yet the image remains. Still examined, still preserved, still surrounded by questions, and still standing at the center of one of the most enduring traditions in Catholic history. Perhaps that is the deepest mystery of Guadalupe. It is not simply that scientists have failed to explain every physical characteristic of an old image, because science may eventually explain many of those characteristics. The deeper mystery is that an image associated with a moment nearly 500 years ago continues to speak to people in the present, continues to inspire prayer, continues to draw pilgrims, and continues to direct the hearts of millions of Catholics toward the Mother of God, and through her, toward Jesus Christ. And perhaps that is why the tilma continues to invite us to look more closely. Not merely at the fibers, not merely at the colors, not merely at the eyes, but beyond the image itself, toward the meaning that generations of believers have found within it. Because the Guadalupe mystery does not ask us to abandon reason. It asks us to use reason carefully. It does not ask us to believe every extraordinary claim repeated on the internet. It asks us to distinguish what is established from what remains uncertain. And it does not ask us to choose between scientific investigation and faith, because a Catholic can investigate the physical world honestly while still recognizing that the deepest meaning of a sacred image cannot be reduced to what a microscope can see. Nearly 500 years after Juan Diego first opened his tilma, we are still looking at that mysterious face, still asking how the image was formed, still studying the remarkable details that have fascinated investigators, still remembering the explosion that failed to destroy it, and still standing before a piece of cloth that somehow crossed the enormous distance between the 16th century and our own. The world around the image has changed almost beyond recognition, but the image remains. And perhaps that is why the story of Guadalupe refuses to become merely a story from the past. It remains a question placed before every generation that encounters it, a question that invites the careful eye of the investigator, the skepticism of the historian, the curiosity of the scientist, and the humble heart of the believer.